Now, the Extinction Rebellion climate protests ended their fourth day with a milestone. More than 1,000 people have now been arrested. Today's attempt to shut down London City Airport failed, but the group have succeeded in causing mass disruption in London. So, do their tactics and messaging serve a vital function in pushing climate change up the agenda? Or could they put off people who, like the Prime Minister, write them off as uncooperative crusties? Here's our economics editor, Ben Chu.
We're all going to die, and it's the end unless we actually do something ourselves.
That all life on Earth, 97% of it, is going to go, and possibly in my children's lifetime.
We are facing the potential collapse of our very civilization.
This is Extinction Rebellion. You can't miss them. Throwing fake blood at capitalist icons.
Ended up on the roof.
Disrupting airports. And city centre road junctions. They want total decarbonisation by 2025, 25 years sooner than the UK government's target. And some say the radicalism of their demands makes them inherently left-wing too. Not to mention their supporters.
There's time, but we can't do it by just pissing around at the margins of the problem. We've got to go straight to the heart of capitalism and overthrow it.
These Extinction Rebellion protesters have disrupted London City Airport, delaying planes and inconveniencing passengers. But are these smart tactics by the group? Does it mobilise broad popular support and force serious action from politicians? Or do these kind of tactics and the extreme rhetoric merely alienate the broader public and lawmakers who they ultimately need to be on their side?
Some people might not like us, but we know from historical evidence and from the social science that they'll be having a conversation about the issues. Unfortunately, this kind of protest works, whereas writing to your MP and signing petitions doesn't really have the impact that it needs to have.
They say they're not political, but is that possible when they're making such drastic demands?
We're not ideological. There may be people in Extinction Rebellion that think a different version of capitalism is cool, or they like this form or that form. It's not down to us to say want this kind of system or not that one or whatever. This one's not working for us.
Polling data seems to suggest the tactics of Extinction Rebellion have been successful in driving the environment up the list of the public's concerns. According to a YouGov poll conducted in April, 24% of people put the environment among their top issues facing the country, ranking it number 4. That's roughly equal to the economy and immigration. And 43% of 18 to 24-year-olds named it as one of their top 3 priorities, versus only 19% of over 65s, suggesting its salience will continue to rise over time.
Climate justice! We want it now!
Now it's not just Extinction Rebellion. There have been the school strikes, the speeches of Greta Thunberg,
we are facing a man-made disaster.
And a major David Attenborough BBC documentary. But Extinction Rebellion's noise clearly helped to drive it up the media agenda. But there's a caveat. While the polls do suggest that the environment is rising in public concerns, it's still below issues like Brexit and health. And moreover, we can't necessarily conclude from those polls that people are prepared to accept the kind of very radical policy agenda implied by Extinction Rebellion's 2025 decarbonisation demand.
The low energy future is one where it essentially says, decarbonise by 2025, shut down large parts of the modern economy. You can't have the lives you're living now, and to you billions of people in the developing world, you can't have them either. Once that kind of impacts on people's lives, then they suddenly get a bit more sceptical about some of the sacrifices they're going to be asked to make.
What do scientists think of the idea that the only way to decarbonise is to get rid of our capitalist system?
It is a market-based capitalist system, and market measures will take us some way to decarbonize the economy, but by themselves they are not sufficient to take us to carbon neutrality, net zero emissions. Movements like Extinction Rebellion and Youth for Climate this year have done a lot to put climate change on the agenda and on the radar of policymakers, and this is certainly a contribution that might, I hope, put action on the table and move us forward.
Moving us forward or potentially a wrong track.
With me in the studio are Sarah Lunnan, Extinction Rebellion activist who organised the most recent demonstrations, and Miles Allen, climate scientist and author of an intergovernmental panel on climate change report. Welcome to both of you. Where were you today, Sarah? Where were you chained to? What were you doing?
No, I wasn't chained to anything today. I've spent most of today in studios, actually, talking to people and actually writing a speech.
Writing a speech, OK. And what do you do for a living when you're not protesting?
At the moment, I'm volunteering full-time for Extinction Rebellion.
OK, because that's one of the questions people ask us when they get in touch about your protests. Are people taking time off work? Do they do this full-time? How do they fund it?
So there's a number of people who are in London today who are taking time off work. My brother, for example, has taken time off work. My sister has recently given a job up. There's a number of people. One man I talked to today, Adam, he said, when you go into the TV studio, he said, make sure you tell them that I've taken 2 weeks off work to be here.
You're doing it full-time because you're volunteering, presumably investing savings or something into this. I asked the question because some people haven't been able to get where they wanted to get to because of these protests. They can't get to their jobs sometimes.
Yep, absolutely. And
do you understand why they lose sympathy?
To be the cause of that happening is really very, very upsetting. And to see that, yeah, it makes me feel really bad to know that I am disrupting people's lives. And it makes me really cross and angry that the lack of action over 30 years has meant that the only way that I can get the climate on the agenda is by taking action such as this. If we don't act and protest in this way, nobody takes any notice.
One of the other reasons some people say they are put off your movement, and I'll bring you in at this point, Miles, is some of the scientific claims don't stack up. Have you found some of the scientific claims made by those associated with Extinction Rebellion unhelpful?
Well, I mean, it was quite gratifying as I wandered through the demonstration yesterday to actually find copies of the IPCC 1.5 degrees report, which we worked on last year, on the tables. I think Extinction Rebellion actually have done a very good job of trying to stick as close as they can to the science. The key thing is the science doesn't actually tell you what to do. All we can do as scientists is tell you what the consequences of your actions are. And then it's up to people to decide.
But, for instance, the name Extinction Rebellion is inherently pointing towards we're going to be extinct. And there have been people, I've got quotes here, for instance, Roger Hallam, one of the three founders, said in August, perhaps you could answer this as well, slaughter, death and starvation of 6 billion people is the reality this century. There's no science that backs that up.
There's a lot of, well, I mean, you can come in on this, but there's a lot of science that backs up the very considerable risks we run if we carry on a path to...
But not 6 billion people. There's no science that calculates it to that level, is there?
There are a number of scientists who have said if we get to 4 degrees, which is where we're heading at the moment, 4 degrees of warming, they cannot see how the Earth can support not 1 billion people, 500 million people. That's 6.5 billion people dying.
Sorry, so you're going to stand by scientifically a projection that says within this century we'll have the slaughter, death and starvation of 6 billion people? It's just good for us to know.
No, because what we can do as scientists is tell you about the risks we face. The risks, the easy risks to predict, to be honest, are the ones that I do, how the climate system responds to rising greenhouse gases. The harder risks to predict are how people are going to respond to losing the weather they knew as their kids.
But I suppose the reason I asked...
risks, and so I imagine what they're talking about there is the risks of the human response to climate change as much as the risk of climate change itself.
But I suppose the point is, if there's no science that says that, do you understand why some people who are sympathetic to your cause also feel like you have fear-mongered? For instance, Roger Hallam has also said our kids will be dead in 10 to 15 years.
So, Emma, I don't know if you heard what Miles said there. He said we are losing the weather we know. All of our agriculture and our food is based on weather that has been around for the last 10,000 years. If we don't have predictable weather, we don't have predictable food sources. We run the risk of multiple losses of harvest in the world's global bread basket.
It's just to the extent that you are. It's just to the extent that you are projecting what you don't know onto the reaction of humans, and that can be counted as fear-mongering. Roger Hallam did say our kids, we just double-checked this before we came on, would be dead within 10 to 15 years.
There's a distinct possibility that we lose not only our food supplies, but but our energy supplies. In California at the
Let's let-
moment,
let's-
millions
Miles
of
is chomping
people
at the bit to
do
get in
not
here.
have
Let's hear
electricity.
from a scientist as well.
There's a lot of possibilities in the future, and I think what was frustrating about this process is if we fixate on things we don't know, we're not even focusing on the things we do know, which is there are perfectly achievable solutions to this problem. I was in a fossil fuel company last week talking to them about 1.5 degrees, and I was asked the question, is there really any way of us getting to net zero emissions by 2050? And I asked them, well, if you had to make the product you sell carbon neutral by 2050, would you be able to do so? And they just looked at each other and said, yes, of course we would.
So is that
the
something...
solutions are out there.
But that's really interesting. Is that going to be one of your focuses? Because what we were just hearing in the film there is that there has been some of the people that you work alongside, you protest alongside, have talked about overthrowing capitalism, and yet here a solution might be working with some of the architects of it, the oil companies.
So Miles is talking about how we could move to net zero by 2050. Moving to net zero by 2050 gives us a 50-50 chance of staying at 1.5 degrees or below. That's not a risk that I want to take. So 1.5 degrees, we might stay within a stable climate. If we go over that, all bets are off, really. We don't know how hot it's going to get. I do not want to take a 50-50 chance on the future of everybody that I cherish.
Well, Sarah's just dumped all over that, quickly.
Let me come back to the 1.5 report. The risks go up with every half a degree of warming. Nobody's going to say, you know, oh, yes, we'll settle for an extra half a degree and it won't matter. At no point did we say that if we cross 1.5 degrees, the warming will immediately accelerate out of control. So what we're looking at is how do we manage to stabilise this phenomenon that's going on? And I think the key point is those saying we have to overturn capitalism in order to do it. My main concern is I don't know if we've got time to overturn capitalism first and solve climate change later. I'd rather enlist some of the forces we've got available to us today to solve the problem now.
I think you and Sarah are going to have a lot to talk about offset because we have run out of time, but
no,
there you go.
We've waited for 30 years for capitalism to work and it hasn't worked. And Emma, when you go home, you will look at your children and you think I've got a 50-50 chance of it staying within a world that we know as it is today.
Okay.
And the people looking at home,
thank you very much.
This is
where we have to leave it. Thank you very much for your time.